You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. Chapter 68. Eliana leaned her back against Cyrus, absorbing his warmth, as if it might shield her from the night breeze floating in from the sea. He pushed back as though it were a game, something to distract them during their midnight watch. It had been almost 3 weeks since they'd left North Point, but the water to the north and the desert to the south had remained unchanged. Felk had been born again, much to Silmar's irritation, and was in his arrogant adolescent phase, though still as loyal as ever. The next day they'd be abandoning the never-ending grainy coasts of the northern sea to head for the canyon separating them from the Mindron Mountains. Supposedly, the smooth pebbles would give way to dark rocks, and the hills full of brush would be replaced by treacherous cliffs and caves. But for now, all they saw on the horizon to the north, east, and west was water and sand, and all they saw to the south was the Balric Desert. Eliana shivered, pulling her cloak tighter. "How is it still so cold when we're only a week from summer solstice?" she asked. "We're not far from the glaciers and icebergs in Amranis," Cyrus said, his voice muffled from behind her. "Veldin says you can see them from the beach on a clear day, but I wonder if people are seeing the shimmer of the barrier. Still, I should start watching more closely. I could be the first Lorvandan to see the coast of Amranis." "Unless my father saw it," Eliana whispered, wondering where her father was. If he was dead, like Arvid had said, or if he still lived, like her mother. Was it truly possible for her to meet her parents after all these years? What would she even say to them? "I know you're sending me back." Eliana frowned, then turned to catch Cyrus's profile. He toyed with the leather necklace, the lump under his shirt still a mystery to Eliana. Not that the shape of his fake starlock mattered. Only maybe it did. If he chose it as representation for his life, it could be full of rich meaning. "Sending you back?" she asked. "To Lorvandis, when we get the golden arrow." He angled to see her too, his eyebrows raised. "I know you asked Garen to take me. Even if he never shows, you'll want me to return home." She bit the inside of her cheek. "Isn't that what you want?" "I want to go home to check on Gamps, maybe find your father, but I can't promise I won't use the arrow to come right back here. I'm not sure I can stay away after being a part of all this." He gestured toward the beaches. "There's so much I can learn from the Vendarans. Maybe then I can take it back to my family, my people." He didn't hold her gaze, and his eyes flashed with something unfamiliar. Apprehension? Maybe guilt? "You're considering their worship of the sun, aren't you?" His gaze rested on the sand at their feet, his jaw tightening. "I'm willing to research it further. Even if I continue to disagree, their perspective will give me context for my own faith." Eliana hid her smile. Garen just might win the unofficial bet he'd placed with her. She reached for the dagger, running her thumb along the daisy on the pommel. I would be grateful if you sought out my father. I worry about the dangers of Vendaris being too much for someone without magic. But I suppose most of the people here are just like you, only they have inactive star blood. He nodded, the hint of a smile on his lips. Is it wrong for me to want Lorvandans to be right? Eliana asked. About the stars? She nodded. The sun the Vendarans worship sounds frightening, whereas our stars are friendly. I suppose it doesn't matter what we want. We should desire to find the truth. He gazed across the desert. We haven't always liked everything we learn about Vendaris, but that doesn't mean it's not true. That quote you recited when I was healing Lukai. Eliana swallowed down her shame. Was it from the Song of the Stars? He hesitated. No, actually. It was from the Sins of the Stars. She nodded, more to show acceptance of him quoting such a book than because she understood. She'd never read the book, and the words had seemed familiar. Was it something her parents had read to her as a child? Kendallin and Holm came to relieve them of their watch, and Eliana was slow to ready herself for bed, the thoughts Cyrus had shared weighing on her mind. She fell asleep debating her own faith, but woke to the sound of shouts and growls. She bolted up, reaching for her dagger while scanning the camp. Her heart sank at the sight of the sinewy forms of several young Winnicks. A few of the creatures brandished crude weapons, but most used their fists. Silver blood spewed from the wounds her comrades had inflicted, but the creatures fought on. Kendallin sported a bloody nose, and Lukai remained locked in a tight hold with the Winnicks, while another fought him from behind. She sought out Felk's familiar form, but before she could find him among the strangers, a beast skidded to a stop at her bedroll. Your turn. His face screwed up as he hissed, and he spun a bloody blade in his hand. Eliana's stomach dropped when she recognized it as Veldon's dagger. The creature lunged at her, and she tripped over her pack in her effort to sidestep him. The blade grazed her arm, and she sucked in a breath as blood seeped from the wound. The magic of her past called to her, rising up from within. It demanded to be used, to protect her from the enemy standing before her. But the blood seemed to call to the Winnicks, too. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath in through his nose, running the blade beneath it. He grabbed her arm, his hands like ice, then licked Eliana's wound, making her recoil. A soft, melodious chime fell off his lips, and Eliana relaxed under his grip. His tone was deeper than Felk's, but still so comforting. The Winnicks released her arm and held the dagger over his head. Eliana knew she should move, but the peace that had settled over her made her a heartbeat too slow. The dagger came down, but instead of piercing her chest, it went through the silver flesh of another Winnicks, who had thrown himself across her body. He screamed, and the force of the stab brought them both to the ground. Despite the sand, her head hit the ground hard, and through the pain, her focus cleared. Her attacker swore, bending over her rescuer. She rolled out from under the injured Winnicks and caught sight of Felk's tear-shaped scar as his face contorted in pain. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Her hands brushed his cheek, and his eyes opened. A small smile tugged at his lips, but his breath came out ragged, and the dagger remained wedged in his arm as silver blood pooled beneath him. Eliana turned to face the other Winnicks, tightening her grip on her own dagger. A malicious grin crossed his face, even though he held no weapon. The starlock warmed at her chest, its gentle reminder filling her with premature relief. The creature leaped at her, curving his body to avoid her dagger while grabbing at her hair. He wrenched hard, twisting her head and nearly lifting her off her feet. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she slashed out with her dagger, forcing him to drop his hold. Before she could even consider what magic to use, he was on her again, but she gave the creature a swift kick to his knee. A sickening crack filled the air, and the Winnicks came down with a shriek that halted the battle around them. The newly injured Winnicks writhed in pain. He tried to rise, but crumpled on his twisted knee, scooting away from Eliana, his youth finally showing in the wake of his rabid assault. For the first time, Eliana turned her back on a suffering creature, even wondered if he deserved it. "I'm so sorry, Felk." She bent over him, tucking her dagger back in its sheath. "I'll fix this, I promise." He moved as if to reply, but she yanked the other dagger from his arm, and a scream came out instead. She placed a hand over his wound, letting the heat of the starlock fill her before it surged out to flood Felk's veins, twisting through his injury to find the broken vessels and torn flesh. Panic and fear drove her power, making her magic as forceful as when she'd first started, but this time with more focus. She sang the lullaby that had once calmed him, partly to calm herself. It had been several days since he was small enough to be sung to sleep, but now he used the hand on his good arm to wipe her tears as he hummed along. Marnock's instructions for mending guided her more than Lukai's and Silmar's explanations ever had. And within moments, the heaviest flow of blood had stopped, the severed artery healed. A strange relief flooded through her. This was what she should have done for Lukai. This was how her power was intended to work, without the temptation of blood magic. Her power rose, desperate for more nooks and crannies to fill, giving her the same bloated sensation she'd had before weaning. As the lullaby came to an end, the silence around her should have been alarming, but she shut it out by closing her eyes, letting the flow of her magic guide her as she used her blood's power to repair Felk's arm. She sensed the muscles rebinding and the skin reconnecting beneath her hand, but the wound was deep, and her power drained too quickly. The blood leaking from her arm called to her, reminding her she had another source available, that she could do this faster, with less of a drain on her reserves. This time, she balled her free hand into a fist, half of her focus shifting to resisting the blood magic's pull. Her hands trembled as she held her breath, but at last, she sensed that the skin was closed, and his pain was a dull ache, a memory of the agony he'd held. Felk's hand patted her cheek. "It's all right, Mama. Thank you." She opened her eyes, taking in his solemn gaze. His hand dropped to hers, his grip steady. For a moment, she studied the fresh gray skin covering his injury. Marnock would be proud, and for some reason that mattered to her. She glanced up, wondering how the rest had fared. Dozens of bulbous eyes stared at her, the Winix's silver mouths hanging open. Eliana's companions could have taken every one of them out in that moment. But instead, they held defensive stances, warily glancing between Eliana and the surprised Winix. One Winix still glared at her from his place near her on the ground, his knee bent at an odd angle. He'd dragged himself closer, but his face was contorted with pain, his energy spent. Eliana sat back on her heels, debating if she had enough energy to heal him, if he was worth it if she did. She stood on shaky legs, but before she could approach him, he squinted, the hatred in his eyes almost palpable. In one fluid motion, he pulled himself up and lunged at her, teeth bared. The others shouted, no one near enough or prepared to help. Eliana's starlock warmed with one last bit of strength, surging through her with a desperate force. She reached for her dagger, twisting it forward as if to block the Winix's attack, but then let it loose, knowing that with her magic, its aim would be true and its force would be lethal. It buried to the hilt in the Winix's chest as the creature's momentum kept him flying toward her, knocking her down, but his bared mouth went slack. Eliana pushed the Winix off her, then used a knee against his chest to remove her dagger, his body falling to the sand with a sick thud. Her shoulders slumped, and her hands fell at her sides, the tip of her dagger dripping blood on her skirt. Her companions remained in their defensive stances, but none of the Winix moved to attack. A soft silver hand found its way into her own, and she raised her head to see Felk nod his understanding. The Winix that remained went impossibly still. "You healed him," one Winix said, gesturing at Felk. Eliana suspected the Winix was female, her frame slightly smaller and her voice higher than Felk's. "He's our friend." Eliana's grip tightened around Felk's hand. The Winix cocked her head in confusion, her large eyes darting between Felk and Eliana. "You—" The same Winix spoke up, but then turned to Felk. "They stole you. We came to bring you back." "She didn't steal me. She raised me." Felk stood even taller as the words left his lips. Several Winix backed away, as though ready to slink into the brush. Eliana took in the state of her comrades. Surface injuries were scattered across their bodies, but the Winix were in far worse shape. A few Winix lay slain, and others had injuries that would never properly heal. "We can heal your wounded," Eliana offered, before they got too far. The Winix stopped. "Eliana!" Silmar's warning tone demanded attention, but Eliana ignored him. "You say you came to rescue Felk," she continued. "So it appears this was a misunderstanding. We'll heal your wounded, and Felk can choose to join you if he wishes to be with his kind." The last words pained her, but it was time. She knew she couldn't keep him with her forever, and Felk deserved the opportunity to be with his people. The self-appointed leader eyed her suspiciously. "Not all came to free. Those with Baljek," she gestured to the dead Winix at her feet, "came for blood." "Thank you for your honesty." Eliana turned and raised her voice, making sure her gaze took in every stunned Winix before her. Those of you wanting peace and healing, you will have it. Those of you wishing for blood may leave, or it will be your own blood that's shed. The Winix exchanged troubled looks, and several rushed off into the desert. Would you like help burying your dead? Cyrus asked the female Winix. She shook her head. Not our way. The others sneaked away through the brush, the camp quickly becoming deserted of Winix. The female came forward and offered her arm to Eliana. A gash dripped silver, and Eliana placed a hand over it, ready to heal. No. She gripped Eliana's forearm, placing them in a handshake of comrades. Thank you for mercy. If we meet in another moon, forgive me when I don't remember. She turned to leave, but her gaze rested on Felk, and she waited. Eliana held her breath. He should go. She knew he should. Felk faced her, and the indecision on his face broke her. They seem like a good group, she lied. No group of wild Winix was good enough for him. He stood taller and spoke clearer. He'd been changed by her influence. Would he last among a group of real Winix? I'll find you again, Ma. His voice cracked, and she nodded. He wouldn't find her. And if he did, he wouldn't remember her. They both knew that. She reached out a hand to touch the teardrop forever on his cheek. The female Winix turned, loping off through the brush. Perhaps I'll find you first. Eliana gave him a smile, and he buried his face in her shoulder, his arms wrapped tightly around her back. Now go, she whispered, gently shoving him away. He ran after the Winix, and her arms ached with the emptiness. Eliana turned back to the camp. Lukai finished healing a scratch on Kendallin's face, then approached Veldon. The others slowly found their bedrolls or went back to taking watch on the berm. The sun's morn wouldn't come for a few more hours, but Kendallin built up the fire, already pulling out pans to cook the morning meal. Before Eliana could process the normalcy in the wake of the attack, Silmar stood before her. You reacted. She almost missed his soft words. A light breeze swept in from the sea, and Eliana hugged herself at the sudden chill. Does it make you happy that I was finally willing to take a life? The question came out bitter, as her shock gave way to the reality of what she'd done. Although she wasn't sure Silmar would count Baljek as a life. The image of his lifeless eyes, so like Felk's, swam through her mind. She pursed her lips to keep them from trembling. No. I'm grateful your training is saving your life. He leaned over his staff, studying her closely. Even good choices can have consequences that are difficult to bear. Cyrus was right to tell you the motive can change the outcome. But sometimes, the motive merely makes the outcome more bearable. Tears gathered in her eyes, and she nodded. Pushing past him, she settled back in her bedroll, knowing she wouldn't sleep any more that night. Chapter 69. Eliana couldn't help looking for Felk over the next few days. A part of her still hoped to see him, even though she knew it was better for him to move on. But the Winnicks either left or remained hidden. As their group traveled away from the coast, the eastern horizon shifted from seashore to cliffs, and the sandy desert to sheer rock. Aura remained in her constant position as a straggler in the back of the group. So Eliana slowed, thinking the older woman's calming presence might be good for her raw nerves. Aura nodded when Eliana approached, but said nothing. At first, it made Eliana even more anxious, but soon the rhythm of the waves against the cliffs and the clip-clop of the horses' hooves lulled her to a state of calm. It was almost as if Aura knew, and waited for that moment. "It's never easy to say goodbye to someone you love," she said. For some reason, Eliana pictured Karyne hearing this obvious statement and rolling his eyes. It made the corners of her mouth twinge, and she rested her hand on the dagger, running her thumb over the daisy on its pommel. As much as she missed Felk, if she was honest, it was Baljek, the dead Winnicks, who occupied her thoughts more. She'd killed someone. Maybe not a human, but a creature capable of reasoning with her, of speaking. It didn't sit well with her, and she wasn't sure what to do about it. Which made it far easier to talk about Felk. "You never seemed to disapprove of Felk, but you never spoke to him either," Eliana said. "What do you think about the Winnicks?" Aura took so long to reply that Eliana wondered if she would get an answer. "I think there's far more to them than most mortals realize." It was another evasive answer, but Eliana got hung up on the word mortals. She'd always been fascinated by the fact that Winnicks were immortal in a sense. But in some ways, it sounded as if Aura was excluding herself when referring to mortals. "Have you ever befriended a Winnicks, or known someone who has?" Aura smiled. "No. As far as I know, you are the first." That news should have been disheartening, because it meant the Winnicks had been mistreated for thousands of years. Instead, it left her warm, knowing she had encouraged change to take place, that she was looking out for those in need, and her actions were making a difference. She kept watching for Felk, but her mind felt more free, able to look ahead instead of only behind. Jasperus and Holm guided them away from the water through a narrow crevice to the south, and they winded their way into a small canyon. Leaving the open water had been good progress, but riding single file while hedged in between two walls twice their height left Eliana on edge. Their long trek was coming to an end, but what waited for them? A madwoman who had trapped Eliana's mother? A massive army they could never defeat? Summer solstice was only a handful of days away, and she still didn't feel prepared. When they broke for the midday meal, Veldon rode out ahead of the others. If there were any troops left from the dragon's attack on Islara, they would know by tonight. She sent up a prayer to the stars that there might be at least one or two factions to instill hope in them again. Cyrus took himself to a spot in the shade where he lay prostrate on the canyon floor, sending up prayers, though Eliana couldn't help wondering whom he prayed to. Even Lukai and Kendallin tipped their faces to the sun, as if calling upon it for assistance. Silmar frowned down at his food, admonishing them between bites.
You all need to eat. We need our strength for tonight and the days to come.
Everyone else continued picking at their food. When they rode out again, no one spoke. Everyone's gaze remained on the canyon's rise, watching for Velden's return. As the sun sank lower in the sky, the hesitant quiet turned to thick sobriety. Darkness came quick as the canyon walls hid the sun's light. Shadows loomed like dark spirits, making even the horses a bit skittish. Every rock that fell out of place echoed off the walls, distorting their ability to stay alert for enemies. Eliana found herself longing for the open sea and sandy desert that she had grown tired of the past few weeks. Velden should have returned by now, if there was nothing to find. But he also should have returned if there was exciting news to share. Should anyone else ride ahead to check on him? Eliana asked. Silmar grunted in response, but the lack of answer implied he was debating the same thing. After another hour, when the darkness became a hindrance, Silmar signaled for them all to stop.
Home. Take Jasperus southeast around that peak, and see if you can catch sight of Velden. If we don't see him, we'll stay the night here.
The others exchanged glances. Is this the end of the canyon? Eliana asked.
This is as far south as it goes.
Silmar scratched at his beard before dismounting.
It continues west through parts of the desert we passed. If we travel a day's ride east, we'll reach the edge of the Mindran Mountains. Mavis lives on the southeast side, so she should still be another day's ride beyond that. Just south of here, we'll reach the slope of the Valley of Kron. That's where our troops were meant to gather.
So close to her home? Eliana asked.
The valley is a safe enough place. Her guards don't often trek beyond the southern edge of the mountains. The population north of the Mindran Mountains isn't large enough to concern Mavis, which is why we wanted our troops to take the long way through and come around from the north side. It's possible she'd eventually learn of people gathering there, but it's a common location for large groups to set up festivals. Some of our allies typically hold a summer solstice celebration there, so she shouldn't grow suspicious, especially if our numbers have dwindled.
His frown deepened. Holm and Jasperus made their way toward a thin path weaving up the canyon wall. With all of the switchbacks to make the steep incline less severe, it was likely they wouldn't return before the sun's sleep. But as Eliana watched them rise, another figure emerged at the top of the canyon. Sighs of relief went through the others, even though he was too far away to make out details. Then, the man they assumed to be Velden began rhythmically pumping his arms.
What is he doing?
Cyrus asked as Velden added spurts of water like a fountain to the waves, confirming his identity. Silmar made a choking noise that sounded suspiciously like a laugh.
He's giving me the count of soldiers, and he's celebrating.
Hope grew in Eliana's gut. How many soldiers are there?
At least 6,000,
Silmar said.
He's still waving, and each wave represents a faction that survived.
They counted 2 more waves and spurts. 8,000? Then most of them left Islara before Durakan arrived. Eliana's hopes soared.
"We might have a chance, after all,"
Silmar said. They set up camp while waiting for Velden to make it back down the canyon. He arrived long after most of them would have been asleep, but everyone was eager to hear his news. They sat around the campfire, squeezed in tight due to the canyon walls. Kendallin served him a bowl of stew, but the questions came too quick for him to eat.
"Only a couple of factions were lost," Velden said. "They left in intervals. Some knew nothing of Durican because they left days before his arrival. Others left only half a day before he came. Several attempted to turn back and defend the city. Most of them had family in there. But it quickly became apparent that they wouldn't stand a chance against him."
His grin faded, and everyone grew quiet as they remembered the horrific scene they'd left behind. How did the dragon not see them on his way from the mountains? Kendallin asked. Velden's face bunched up in thought.
"That's the curious part. Several of the soldiers admitted to seeing the dragon flying both directions. He paid no attention to the troops. It's almost as if he didn't care about them."
"That doesn't make sense," Holmes said, his face grave in the firelight. "She would have told him to attack the soldiers." Velden raised a finger, and a sly grin crossed his face.
"Unless, maybe, she told him to attack Islara. Maybe he knew exactly what she wanted, but he got around it by doing exactly what she said instead. It does leave room for the possibility that he was never truly working with her."
Eliana bit her lip, hesitant to show any pleasure at Velden's words. It was hard to be grateful that Durican only killed the townspeople instead of the soldiers. But still, if he'd been a prisoner to Mavis, she'd made the right choice by letting the dragon go free. Velden gave her a small nod before finally slurping down some of the stew.
"So they're prepared to launch an attack by the week's end?"
Silmar asked.
"They're all lined up in the Valley of Kron, waiting for further instruction. They were planning to launch an attack and retrieve Emrys whether or not they saw us, in case we'd perished in Islara." "Tomorrow we'll have to meet with the generals to study their plans."
Silmar leaned against his staff, staring into the fire's light.
"They probably have a better idea of how to approach the fortress than we do, if they've been scouting it out these past weeks. Realistically, they can do whatever they want to attack her fortress. They're a means of distraction."
"Distraction?" Cyrus asked.
"I thought they were helping us get in." "They are," Silmar said. "They're helping us get in by distracting her soldiers so we can sneak through a side entrance."
Everyone began talking amongst themselves, less concerned over the details now that their task seemed possible. The threat less intimidating. It was all too new for Eliana to hold the same confidence. She watched as their shadows flickered against the canyon wall, far more formidable than they actually were. It was exactly how they all felt tonight. Stronger, surer of themselves. But in the morning, when the firelight was gone and their shadows receded, what would the sun reveal? Was this a task they were truly ready for?
"You're quiet," Velden whispered. "I thought you'd be happy to hear they had survived and that your dragon might not be so bad."
She smiled more for his sake than because she actually felt any sense of happiness. "He's not my dragon," he hummed, bobbing his head back and forth.
You'd be surprised at the memory of a dragon. Your actions won't be forgotten. He owes you his life."
"How do you know about dragons' memories?" Eliana sat up taller. "They say Durakin is the only one."
"He's the last one," Velden corrected. "There was another when I was young, possibly Durakin's father. They flew together, making their nest in the cliffs on the northeast side of the Mindran Mountains. People could go years without catching sight of them. Made us all wonder if they could cross the barriers. But they still turned up."
"To hunt people?" Cyrus leaned in to join the conversation.
"No, actually." Velden paused to tip his bowl back and take in the last of the stew. "They would take cattle now and then, but until Islara, I hadn't heard of dragons killing people. At least, not since the wars. Although Durakin hadn't been spotted for over 10 years until recently. Who knows what he was doing in that time?"
"So, what about their memories?" Eliana couldn't stop thinking of the way Durakin had given her his memories, the way she'd sensed his desire for her to know his past. Guilt pricked at her when she realized she'd never told anyone what he'd done. But if he was free now, did it matter anyway? He should be long gone.
"Ah, that's more from legends. Cities used to set out portions of their herds and crops, almost like an offering to stay in the dragon's goodwill. The dragons each had their regions and were kept happy. Eventually, men were disgruntled at the arrangement, figured dragons could hunt for their own food. Which they did. They hunted among the people's farms."
Velden laughed and shook his head.
"Except one family continued leaving meager offerings for the dragons. Their farm was never touched."
"It doesn't surprise me," Eliana said. His gaze held an intelligence and focus beyond most people's. It was unnerving, but also sort of... She trailed off, not sure how to describe it.
"Comforting," Velden said. "It's like they see straight through your soul, but they just keep looking, taking you in and assessing without judgment."
His words reminded Eliana of Kendallin's statement that people liked to be truly seen and accepted. She scanned the camp for the other woman, who sat near Lukai, leaning in to whisper something that made him laugh. Something inside Eliana twinged, along with her bond mark, but she shook it off, not ready to examine if a tiny seed of jealousy meant their bond was starting to take. Excitement kept everyone up later than usual, and if the rustling indicated the others were tossing and turning as much as Eliana, she assumed hardly anyone slept that night. They all rose early and broke camp while it was still dark. The sun soon cast light across the sky, but the canyon kept everything hidden for a little longer. Despite the lack of sleep, everyone was in high spirits, eager to join the troops. It made the long climb out of the canyon feel shorter. A few miles from the canyon's edge, the hills parted once more, but this time for a rolling valley filled with trees, grass, and thousands of troops. A grin split Eliana's face, making her realize how long it had been since she'd truly smiled. She hadn't been able to imagine a crowd this size, and now that she looked at the waves of people milling about like ants, she still couldn't believe what she was seeing.
"We'll stay together and make camp on the northern edge," Silmar said. "They're on our side, but we have a slightly different agenda. One they can't all know about in case Mavis has noetics in her fortress. This morning
he cut off as a dark shadow briefly fell over them, making the horses twitch. Most of her companions drew weapons, but Eliana's limbs went numb as she turned to the sky. Durakin made a circle high in the sky above them, before diving straight at them. Several of the others loosed arrows, but Eliana could only stare as Durakin swept past them, his gaze locked on hers. He came close enough for her to hear his snort and feel the rush of air from his wings, close enough for her to see a new black brand darkening his paw. "I freed you," she murmured. "You're supposed to be free." How had she not considered the possibility of him being rebranded? Mavis likely had stores of his blood, ready to use at any moment. The beast turned toward the valley, his wings glinting in the sun, and then he breathed fire across the scattering troops. Eliana slid from her horse with a cry, dropping to her knees as hundreds of men were killed in an instant. Those in the center received the mercy of instant death, but those on the edges ran, tripping and falling as the flames licked their boots. Screams tore through the air, reaching Eliana with an eerie delay.
"Home, Iris, Jasperus, take her back into the canyon,"
Silmar said. "No." Eliana forced herself to stand. "I'll go with you. He won't hurt me."
"You're right,"
Silmar said.
"He won't. And I find that just as concerning. I'm not letting him take you straight to Mavis."
"That's where we're headed anyway," Eliana argued, pulling herself back up onto her horse. "If you find my mother, you'll find me. But I'm not letting all these men die if she sent him after me." She kicked her horse's sides, relieved that the mare didn't balk at the chaos she aimed for. Durakin made a second pass and annihilated dozens more. The soldiers scattered, tripping over each other, but there was nowhere for them to hide. Most ran toward Eliana, toward the canyon, knowing the walls were too narrow for Durakin's wings, but they would never make it in time. Hooves pounded behind her, and Eliana hoped her comrades were coming to help her, instead of stop her. Her mind raced right alongside her mare, debating her options. She wanted to rescue the soldiers, even if it meant sacrificing herself. But was there a way for her to free Durakin again, too? Was it worth it if Mavis would just brand him again? As the crowd of troops surged around her, she was forced to dismount to keep making her way closer to the center of the camp, closer to the place where Durakin might see her. She lost sight of Silmar and the others, swarmed by a sea of strangers. She pressed her hands together, drawing the power up from her center and out of her starlock, letting it build until even her clasped hands couldn't contain it. The glow that extended from her hands was the biggest light shield she'd made yet, extending on either side of her almost a dozen feet, as well as above. The wall of light moved with her, passing through soldiers whose mouths dropped in awe. At first, they fled from the shimmering light, but as they watched her pass through smoldering tents to snuff out flames, a horde gathered around her, desperate for the shield to protect them, too. Initially, she welcomed them. That was the whole point of the shield, to keep people safe. But as the crowd grew, her shield couldn't contain them all. Durakin turned in the sky, headed back for another pass over the troops. He lazily scanned the people until his gaze locked on Eliana's shield. It drew him in like a beacon, and too late, Eliana realized the people who could have been fleeing were now fighting each other for a prime spot behind her shield. "Run!" Her gaze caught on the soldiers at the edges of her shield, their panic making them climb on top of backs or shove down people caught off balance. Durakin was nearly upon them, the majestic flap of his wings like the iridescent curve of a seashell. He opened his mouth, his massive chest expanding with inhaled air. In moments, he would breathe fire, knowing Eliana was safe, knowing he would annihilate everyone outside her shield. All these people would die, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Eliana dropped the shield with a groan, the effort of reversing her magic dizzying. Her knees started to give out, but she reached for a soldier beside her, desperate to see what Durakin did. The beast's eyes widened, and a strange choking sound left his throat as he held back his flames. His chest nearly brushed the tips of the soldiers' swords and shields as he passed, the wind of his wings knocking everyone to the ground. But they were alive. It took Eliana far too long to stand again, but she couldn't help grinning. As long as she was with the people, they were safe. Durakin wouldn't harm them. She tracked him once more, wondering how she could use that knowledge to her advantage, and her smile fell. Orange flames poured from his mouth like liquid fire, dropping down on another faction. She hadn't saved lives. She'd merely exchanged who lived and who died. As long as Durakin was here, he would keep killing. Not because he wanted to, but because he was compelled by Mavis. Eliana needed to stop him, not just to save these people, but to save Durakin. The people around her resumed running, forcing her back as she stubbornly stood her ground, watching as the dragon circled once more. Elbows jostled her side, and people yelled at her for blocking their escape. She ignored them, raising shaking hands far above her head. "Come and get me," she whispered. "It's me you want." Once again, Durakin scanned the crowd. Eliana let a burst of light leave her hands, a pathetic attempt at a shield, but exactly what she needed to draw his gaze. She might have imagined it, but she swore she saw sorrow in his eyes as he approached. The people around her screamed and scattered, leaving Eliana out in the open. With a touch far gentler than she'd anticipated, the great beast's paws wrapped around her midsection, and her feet left the ground. I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might enjoy listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where Paeter and I narrate fantasy short stories from a variety of authors to help you find your next favorite author. Check it out at findingfantasyreads.com. Thanks so much for listening.